for Scotland. Public spending could have been brought forward so we can have stimulus and recovery, but Labour have turned their back on that. That could cost thousands of jobs.
This pre-election budget may well be judged by the headlines it generates. The next, whoever delivers it, will have to be about cuts, whether voters like it or not. Nick Robinson, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, the Chancellor explained that a tax on bank bonuses is bringing in some £2 billion. That is almost 4 times the original forecast. And this had helped to reduce the budget deficit by some £11 billion to £167 billion, still an immense sum by historical standards. Our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders, has been looking at the budget numbers in some detail.
There's still a river of red ink running through Whitehall. But the good news from Mr Darling today was that it's slowly, very slowly, starting to go down. Call it the count yourself lucky budget. The recession was tough, the Chancellor said, but not as tough as we expected. And the difference is down to our policies. Now, experts will be debating for years whether the government can take any credit for the fact that unemployment's lower than expected, the number of business failures is lower as well. But the Chancellor today did reap the benefits, announcing for the first time in years that the borrowing forecasts were going down. He said the gap between spending and revenues this year wouldn't be £178 billion, as he forecast in December, but £167 billion. The number for future years is lower as well. As a result, the total stock of government debt will be £67 billion lower in 2014 than he thought a few months ago. That's the good news. The bad news is that the total debt in that year will be 20 times that, more than £1,400 billion. So the Chancellor had room for some morsels for voters, but not many, and they don't last. There's a small net giveaway this year of £1.4 billion, including the extra winter fuel payments, phasing in the rise in fuel duty and that temporary cut in stamp duty for first-time buyers. But look ahead, the plans show he'd take it all back and then some if Labour stayed in office. The stamp duty cut only lasts 2 years, but the rise for houses worth more than £1 million carries on. He'd raise fuel duty in future years as well.
It's a modest giveaway in the short term, paid for by the extra money that the Treasury is getting from the bank bonus tax. But thereafter, it's actually a modest net takeaway. You've got higher stamp duty, higher inheritance tax, higher tobacco duty. But either way, it's a small takeaway. At the end, it's a small giveaway at the beginning.
That meant he could sound prudent to the financial markets. Well, as prudent as a Chancellor can sound when he's borrowing £1 for every £4 he spends. The structural deficit, the part that won't go away with the recovery, was 8.4% of national income last year. If Labour wins, Mr Darling now says he'd cut that to 2.5% by 2014.
Basically, it was a politician's budget. The market didn't get any surprises and they didn't get any shocks. What we're really looking at is the election, probably be May the 6th, and the real budget. The budget is probably going to come in 2 months after that election. The market will move on that. That is when the tough cuts need to be made.
Mr Darling had some one-off goodies for companies as well, but business leaders were underwhelmed.
It's modestly positive from a business point of view. There was some help for entrepreneurs and small businesses, but there's some big anxiety still about the shape and the size of the deficit.
To bring down that borrowing, we've had more details of £11 billion in savings that central government is going to have to make. There'll be many more, but there too, this was a Chancellor who wasn't giving much away. Stephanie Flanders, BBC News.
Watching that with me, our business editor, Robert Peston. Robert, let's talk about the banks, given their role in all of this. How did they fit into today's picture?
Well, I think I can exclusively reveal that the Chancellor set something of a budget record. He used the words bank or banking some 38 times, and I can't remember any Chancellor ever focusing on those institutions quite as much as that. And there were a dizzying array of bank initiatives. He's forcing the semi-nationalised banks, Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds Bank, to lend £94 billion to businesses, although some, like the Liberal Democrat leader Nick Clegg, are doubtful about how effective that'll be. He's turning all the banks into sort of semi-public service organisations by saying he's going to legislate to force them to give bank accounts, basic bank accounts, to anybody who can prove they've got an address. We've heard from Stephanie that the £2 billion raised from the bonus tax basically covered the very small number of goodies he's giving away in this budget. He wants to levy a longer-term tax on the banks, as do the Tories. And for the things that the banks themselves can't do, in his view, like sort of sponsor green projects or invest in high-tech businesses, he's setting up his own banks. There's a couple of those that he's announced. What's the big picture here? Well, I'm not telling you something you don't know. The banks aren't terribly popular at the moment. They're widely held as responsible for the economic mess that we got ourselves into, and widely criticised for having taken all that money from taxpayers. So the Chancellor, I think, is doing what politicians will do probably for years to come. He's going to use the banks as an effective target, and he's also going to tap them for the funds that he needs.
Robert, thank you very much. Robert Peston there, our business editor. Well, I'll be very keen to study the voters' reaction to the budget and to assess the possible impact, of course, on the election campaign and the result. Danny Savage reports from Dewsbury in West Yorkshire on what people there made of the pre-election budget.
Whilst Alistair Darling was addressing the House of Commons, he was playing to a slightly smaller audience in this Dewsbury pub. But those who were here were interested.
Budget for jobs is the main thing at the moment.
Looking out for prices on beer and tobacco going up.
Pound a bag on your banana!
Just down the road in the town centre, it was a busy market day. But here they weren't watching, but they were listening. Trish Makepeace has lived here for years, but much of what she heard from the Chancellor didn't appeal.
Do you smoke?
Yes, I do.
Do you drink?
I do.
Do you drive?
I do.
So you've been hit by three things there. Will today affect the way you think about politics, though?
No, because I'm used to them putting increases on things like that. I should probably cut down now on quite a lot of things.
Market worker David Taylor told me he felt as though he's had his pocket pinched.
It's getting to a point where everybody's fighting and scraping every penny now. They're watching the money. Obviously petrol, diesel, food, everything goes up, and it does. But one stage we've got to have a cut-off point.
Round the corner at one of the cafes, the idea of taxing the wealthy more was seen as a good one, but there was doubt if they would share the pain.
The rich always seem to get out of it, so I can't say that the rich will be any worse off.
But why do they get out of it?
I don't know. There always seems to be loopholes why they can tax relief on this and tax relief on that.
But what do the wealthy of West Yorkshire think? Businessman Mike Smith falls into that bracket and has concerns about the housing market.
Well, it's very unfortunate. If you're selling a house £1 million plus, it's going to cost serious amounts of money for the buyers. I think that will affect the housing market at the top end.
But 18-year-old Az wants to get on the housing ladder soon, although he worries about affording it.
I'd still say this is quite expensive to what they normally say, £0 to £250,000. It's still expensive even though they scrap the stamp, I think.
Of course, the budget affects us all in one way or another, so you decide. Is your glass now half empty or half full? Danny Savage, BBC News, Dewsbury.
Well then, let's take stock with our political editor, Nick Robinson, who's in Downing Street for us tonight, and with me here in the studio, our economics editor, Stephanie Flanders. Stephanie, does this change the big picture today?
Well, it's interesting. We've had always Chancellors set low expectations for budgets. I think this is one of those times where the low expectations have been met. If you strip away the sweeteners, the talk of one-offs, this is a budget in which not very much fundamental change. The Chancellor's strategy for dealing with the deficit, for talking about it, is pretty much the same as it was. So if you thought before that he was being a bit optimistic in his growth forecast and his borrowing forecast, you'll probably still think that today, although he's reduced next year's forecast just tiny for growth, tiny amount for growth. And if you thought that he wasn't cutting borrowing fast enough in the future, wasn't pledging to cut borrowing fast enough like the Conservatives do and many outside commentators, you're still going to think that now. And I think that lack of change probably explains why there was a very muted reaction in the markets to this budget. He won't have made any new enemies or friends there, maybe no new friends and enemies anywhere else. But I guess if you're a Chancellor a few weeks away from elections, who's also having to borrow maybe a quarter of what he needs for his spending, a sort of no change, boring budget reaction, maybe the best you can expect.
Stephanie, thanks very much. Let me turn to Nick in Downing Street.